On October 14, 2013, 19-year-old student James Turner disappeared without a trace from the University of Oregon campus in Eugene. For 6 years, the police and his family searched for any clue, but the mystery was only solved in September 2019 in the basement of the abandoned Blackwood Hall estate. Behind a secret door in the cellar, real estate agents found a young man who had completely lost his speech, but looked as if he had just stepped out of the pages of a 19th-century novel. He was wearing an expensive black tailcoat, a snow-white shirt with a high collar, and a silk neckerchief. He did not ask for help, but only looked silently at his rescuers. What force caused the young man to disappear for years, and who was behind the creation of this underground prison? You will find out in this investigation. The events in this story are presented as a narrative interpretation. Some elements have been altered or recreated for storytelling purposes. October 14, 2013, in Eugene, Oregon, was a typical mid-autumn day. Wet, cool, and filled with the smell of wet pine needles and asphalt. For 19-year-old James Turner, a sophomore at the University of Oregon, this Monday was supposed to be a normal end to the school week. According to the official campus security report, the young man's last lecture ended at exactly 6:45 p.m. Witnesses, including James's classmates, recalled during questioning that he seemed energetic, though somewhat tired from preparing for midterm exams. The young man was known for his love of playing guitar and noisy parties, but that evening he did not want to join his friends who were planning a party at one of the local pubs. The university dormitory where James lived was located 3/4 of a mile from the academic building. It was an old 3-story brick building with narrow corridors and heavy oak doors that made a characteristic piercing creak every time they were opened. It was this sound that became the embodiment of the oppressive silence that reigned in room 212 after the student's disappearance. When his roommates noticed James's absence the next morning, the room looked as if its occupant had stepped out for just a moment. An open economics textbook lay on the desk, and next to it stood a paper cup with half a latte, its plastic lid bearing a lip mark. The coffee was cold and the foam had settled, forming a dark film on the sides of the cup. Eleanor Turner, James's mother, arrived in Eugene at 10:30 a.m. on October 15th. According to the woman's statement, which was recorded in the first police report, she immediately sensed that something terrible had happened. Looking through her son's personal belongings, she noticed that 2 significant items were missing: his favorite vintage dark brown jacket, brown leather jacket, and an old silver ring with an engraved coat of arms. James never took off this ring, considering it his talisman. The fact that all other documents, a wallet with $80 in cash, and a phone charger were left behind only heightened his mother's anxiety. The Eugene police initially refused to treat the case as a criminal one. An official representative of the sheriff's department stated at the first press conference that the disappearance of a 19-year-old with no obvious signs of a struggle most often indicates a voluntary departure. Investigators insisted that the young man was simply tired of academic pressure and exams and had decided to take an unplanned vacation. However, Robert Turner, James's father, categorically denied this possibility. According to him, his son had always been responsible and would never have disappeared without telling his parents. According to friends of the family, Robert had aged significantly during those weeks. His hands trembled noticeably every time a new surveillance camera image appeared on the wall of the police station. Analysis of the video camera recordings made it possible to partially reconstruct James's route on October 14, 2013. At 7:12 p.m., a camera at the exit of the dormitory captured a young man wearing the same vintage jacket. He was walking confidently toward the city center. The last recording was made at 7:38 p.m. by an ATM camera at the intersection of 5th and Olive Streets. James simply walked by without even glancing at the lens. After that point, his path disappeared into the darkness of the unlit alleys leading to the waterfront. The search operation in Eugene only gained momentum on the 5th day after his disappearance. More than 150 volunteers combed the outskirts of the city every day, moving in a chain along the banks of the Willamette River. Dog handlers with 3 bloodhounds were brought in to assist in the search. According to the search team leader's report, the dogs picked up a scent near the dormitory, but it broke off exactly half a mile from the river in a vacant lot that locals called the Dead Loop because of the constant fog and lack of any buildings. This place, with thick dry grass and scattered rusty metal supports, was the last point where James's scent could be detected. Over the course of 21 days, volunteers surveyed more than 12 miles of coastline and woodlands around Eugene. Divers repeatedly plunged into the cold waters of the Willamette, but visibility at depth did not exceed 3 feet due to heavy sedimentation after rains. Nothing was found, no vintage jacket, no silver ring, not even a scrap of fabric. By the end of November 2013, James Turner's case was officially declared cold due to a lack of new evidence. The investigation team was disbanded, and the boy's father was left alone with his powerlessness in the face of the indifference of a system that had written off his son as a runaway. The dormitory building continued to stand in the center of the campus, but room 212 was soon occupied by other students. All of James's belongings were packed into 8 large cardboard boxes and sent to his parents' home in Portland. Only an unfinished latte in an empty trash can and an open textbook in the storage room for forgotten items reminded us that this was where the young guitarist's normal life had ended. Winter had begun in Eugene, and snow covered the dead loop on the vacant lot, finally burying any hope of finding answers under the open sky. Exactly 6 years had passed since James Turner's name last appeared in active police reports in the city of Eugene. On September 12, 2019, at 10:45 a.m., 3 real estate agents arrived at the Blackwood Hall estate, located on the northwestern outskirts of the city. The building, surrounded by a dense mass of wild blackberries and old, half-dead oak trees, had been officially considered abandoned for the past 7 years. The estate, built in the Victorian architectural style, stood 3 miles from the nearest residential neighborhood, and the driveway leading to it was practically swallowed up by the forest. According to one of the agents, 30-year-old Mark Sloan, the atmosphere around the house was permeated with an eerie silence, which usually prevails in places where time seems to have stopped. The inspection of the house began on the first floor, but the real find awaited the group in the basement. The basement of Blackwood Hall was 12 feet below ground. It was a labyrinth of gray concrete and bricks darkened by moisture. In the far corner of the cellar, behind massive wine racks, the agents noticed an unevenness in the masonry. According to witness Mark Sloan, when he accidentally pressed on one of the protruding bricks, part of the wall silently swung back on hidden hinges. Behind the secret door was a room measuring approximately 320 square feet, which did not fit in with the overall architecture of the abandoned mansion. The room was decorated like an authentic late 19th century living room. Heavy tapestries with faded images of forest landscapes hung on the walls, and the floor was covered with a thick, handmade wool carpet. 2 gas lamps burned in the room, spreading a faint yellowish light and a specific smell of methane. The air inside was dry and unusually clean, without the slightest hint of basement mold. All the furniture, from the massive oak secretary desk to the deep armchairs upholstered in dark velvet, looked perfectly maintained. There was not a single item in the room that indicated the 21st century. No electric lamps, no battery-powered clocks, no plastic elements. In the middle of this living room, in an armchair by the fireplace, where the wood crackled quietly, sat a man. It was James Turner. According to the agents who first saw the young man, they were struck not so much by his appearance as by his appearance. The 25-year-old man wore an expensive black tailcoat of perfect cut, a snow-white shirt with an extremely high starched collar, and a skillfully tied silk neckerchief. He was holding an open leather-bound book on his lap. When the agents entered, James showed no signs of fear or surprise. He slowly raised his gaze, which, according to Mark Sloan, revealed an almost aristocratic dignity and a complete lack of desire to make contact. The boy did not say a word. He did not rush to the rescuers for help, did not cry, and did not try to explain his presence in the cellar. His silence was absolute. When the first patrol crew arrived at the scene at 11:20 a.m., James continued to sit motionless, staring into space. The police noted that there were no visible marks of handcuffs or ropes on his hands, and the door to the room had no external locks. This gave rise to the first working theory of the investigation. James Turner could have been living in the mansion voluntarily, deliberately hiding from the outside world for all these 6 years. Since Blackwood Hall officially had no owner after the death of the last representative of the family in 2012, the theory of secret reclusion seemed logical at first glance. However, upon closer inspection of the room, a detective from the Lane County Sheriff's Department noticed a number of inconsistencies. The living room decor and James's specific attire seemed too theatrical to be the result of a simple escape from exams or social pressure. Every detail, from the cut of the tailcoat to the choice of gas lamps, pointed to someone's obsessive attention to historical accuracy. According to the testimony of the doctors who examined the young man at the scene, he was physically healthy, but was in a state resembling a deep trance. James did not respond to modern objects such as digital radios or police flashlights, as if they were invisible to him. The police began gathering information about the history of the estate and its basement. Blackwood Hall was located 80 feet from an old forest road, and none of the residents of Eugene who occasionally drove along this route had reported any suspicious vehicles or smoke from the mansion's chimney in the last 6 years. A survey of the area around the estate, conducted at 2 p.m. that same day, revealed no fresh tire tracks or disturbed soil. Inside the living room, investigators found a supply of candles, canned food in unlabeled glass jars, and several sets of spare clothing, all of which were in the style of the late 19th century. James Turner was led out of the Blackwood Hall cellar at 3:10 p.m. He moved calmly, allowing the officers to lead him by the arms, but never once looked up at the sunlight filtering through the oak trees. James's father, Robert Turner, received a phone call at 3:30 p.m., informing him that his son had been found. According to the officer who made the call, the man initially did not believe what he was hearing, and then only asked if it was really his son. The answer was affirmative, but the investigators already understood. The man who had emerged from the basement in a black tailcoat only physically resembled the 19-year-old guitarist who had disappeared 6 years ago. Ahead lay a medical examination and the first attempts to understand what exactly had happened 10 feet underground in the abandoned mansion, which had become a personal time capsule for the student. On September 12, 2019, at 4:20 p.m., an ambulance accompanied by 2 police cars arrived at the emergency room of the Riverbend Regional Medical Center. James Turner, still dressed in a black tailcoat, which looked surreal against the sterile white walls and bright fluorescent lighting, remained completely motionless. According to the report of the doctor on duty, the patient did not resist, but his gaze was fixed on a single point, and his facial muscles showed no emotion, even when the nurses began the procedure of taking blood for toxicological analysis. At the initial stage, investigators from the Lane County Sheriff's Department expressed outright skepticism about the version of violent restraint. One of the detectives who participated in the initial questioning at the hospital later noted in the report that James's behavior resembled a carefully rehearsed role. Law enforcement officials speculated that the young man may have gone too far in his desire to break ties with his past, and was now simply trying to hide the real reasons for his 6-year absence. The theory that the student guitarist had voluntarily turned himself into a recluse in the guise of a 19th century gentleman remained the main one for the first 3 hours after his hospitalization. However, at 8:45 p.m., the situation changed dramatically when doctors completed a detailed examination of James's body. The medical report, a copy of which was attached to the case file, stated that characteristic marks from prolonged wearing of restraints were found on the patient's wrists and ankles. These were both old, deep scars that had already been covered with dense scar tissue and very fresh abrasions left by rough material. In addition, numerous bruises of varying degrees of age were found on his back and shoulders, indicating systematic physical abuse. Any assumptions about consensual play were rejected. Physical evidence clearly indicated that the young man had been held captive for a long time. The toxicology report, received by investigators around midnight, raised even more questions. Traces of powerful sedatives were found in James's blood, which were commonly used to suppress will and correct behavior in closed psychiatric institutions in the last century. According to doctors, these drugs were the cause of his dulled consciousness and strange detachment from reality. He was not simply silent. His nervous system had been artificially induced into a state of deep apathy, making any attempt at dialogue impossible. While describing and removing clothing as material evidence, forensic experts found a small piece of thick cream-colored paper in the right pocket of the tailcoat. The note was written in calligraphic handwriting using ink that matched samples from the early 20th century. The text consisted of only one sentence: "Manners are the face of the soul." A preliminary handwriting analysis conducted the following day confirmed that these words were not written by James Turner. This was the first direct evidence of another person's presence in the young man's life, someone who not only dressed him in a tailcoat, but also tried to instill in him a specific code of conduct. In parallel with the work at the hospital, a group of detectives conducted a second, more thorough search of Blackwood Hall. The contrast between the upper floors of the mansion and the basement was striking. While the main part of the house had been empty for 7 years and was covered in inches of dust, cobwebs, and rodent droppings, the secret room in the cellar looked sterile and clean. The surfaces of the oak furniture were polished with wax. There was not a single soot stain on the gas lamps, and the carpet looked as if it had been cleaned every day. According to the officer who conducted the inspection, the room was kept in order by someone with a maniacal passion for discipline. Forensic experts also noted that despite the lack of modern plumbing, the room had a ventilation system and a fresh water supply through hidden copper pipes, which had been installed in the brickwork quite recently. This required not only significant financial investment, but also specific engineering skills. Someone spent months, and possibly years, transforming the dark basement of an abandoned mansion into a functional living area that imitated a bygone era. As of the morning of September 13, 2015, the police officially changed the status of the case from missing to kidnapping and unlawful imprisonment with aggravating circumstances. Investigators began to speculate that James Turner could not have been alone in Blackwood Hall. The presence of fresh food in the cellar, the maintenance of perfect cleanliness, and the regular administration of medication indicated that the young man had a caretaker, or even several. All this time, while the family was searching for James on the banks of the Willamette River, he was only a few miles from the city center, becoming part of someone's creepy experiment to revive the past. The most important question remained: how the kidnappers managed to remain undetected for 6 years in a house that was officially considered abandoned, and who exactly was behind the words about the face of the soul found in the prisoner's pocket. Before we continue investigating this mysterious case, please subscribe to the channel, like the video, and leave a comment below. Your activity helps YouTube's algorithms promote content, allowing many more people to see this story. Thank you for your support. On September 15, 2019, at 10 a.m., James Turner's first psychological rehabilitation session began in a closed ward of the Riverbend Medical Center. The process was led by Dr. Sarah Miller, a leading specialist in post-traumatic disorders who had experience working with victims of prolonged isolation. According to her initial report, the patient remained in a state of deep sensory depression, but his physical reactions to external stimuli began to become more pronounced. During the first 40 minutes of the session, James simply sat in a chair, keeping his back unnaturally straight, which, according to Dr. Miller, was completely atypical for a person in a state of shock, but fully consistent with the posture of gentlemen of the previous century. The turning point came at 11:15 a.m. when one of the assistants in the observation room accidentally placed a modern smartphone of the latest model on the table in front of James. The young man's reaction was immediate and devastating. According to Dr. Miller's notes in the medical observation report, James's body was seized by a powerful convulsion, and he recoiled sharply from the device, knocking over his chair. His breathing became ragged and wheezy, and his pupils dilated to such an extent that they almost completely covered the iris. It was not just panic, it was a primal fear of an object that his brain refused to identify as part of reality. It was during this attack that James Turner spoke for the first time in 6 years. His voice was hoarse, as if from prolonged disuse of his vocal cords, but his pronunciation remained clear and emphatically correct. Witnesses to the event, including the detective on duty outside the ward, noted that the young man's speech was saturated with archaisms and specific linguistic constructions that had not been used in everyday life for over a century. Instead of shouting the simple word "remove," he used complex phrases, demanding that this devilish mechanism be removed from his sight. After the patient was given a sedative, he began to give his first fragmentary testimony, which shed light on the beginning of his 6-year nightmare. According to Dr. Miller's recollections, James spoke about himself in the third person, or using very formal forms of address. He mentioned that the cellar at Blackwood Hall was not his first prison. During the first 2 years after his disappearance in 2013, he was held in another place, which he described as the house with blue curtains. According to the young man, he spent his days there in complete darkness, unless he was allowed to read by the light of a single candle. The most important detail was his description of the people who controlled every second of his life. James called them the teacher and the lady. He said that these people never addressed him by name, calling him a blank slate. According to the reconstruction of events based on his testimony, the teacher was responsible for his intellectual training. He forced him to memorize the rules of 19th century etiquette, taught him calligraphy, and demanded flawless knowledge of classical literature. Any mistake in pronunciation or incorrect use of cutlery was punished physically. The lady was responsible for his wardrobe and diet, which consisted exclusively of foods that would have been available in the pre-industrial era. The Eugene police, having received this information at 9 a.m. on September 16th, seriously considered the scale of the crime for the first time. This was not a typical kidnapping for ransom or sexual assault. The investigation encountered something much more sophisticated and terrifying, an attempt to completely reformat a human personality. The kidnappers deliberately erased James's memory of the modern world, replacing it with an artificially created reality from the century before last. A critical question arose. Who had enough time, resources, and maniacal dedication to the idea to turn a modern student into a man from the past? Detectives began analyzing all old cases of missing young people in Oregon, looking for similar handwriting or references to blue curtains. At the same time, a group of forensic scientists returned to Blackwood Hall to find any clues that could point to the identities of the teacher and the lady. During the next session, James recalled that the teacher often spoke about the filth of the modern world, and that James was to become a masterpiece of pedagogy, free from technological corruption. These words suggested that the perpetrators might be connected to the educational sphere or academic environment, where ideas about upbringing sometimes took on fanatical forms. The situation at the hospital remained tense. James refused to touch any plastic objects and showed aggression towards bright electric lights, demanding that his room be kept in decent semi-darkness. His father, Robert Turner, who was in the hallway during one such scene, later recalled that his son's voice sounded like a stranger's. "He looked at me as if I were not his father, but some scruffy stranger disturbing the peace of his chambers," the man said in a conversation with the investigator. The psychological wall erected by the kidnappers over 6 years proved to be much stronger than the physical door of the cellar, and now the police had to find those who had so skillfully taught the young man to hate his own era. On September 17, 2019, the investigation into the James Turner case reached a dead end, with technical reports directly contradicting the victim's testimony. The Eugene Crime Lab completed a detailed examination of the black tailcoat in which the young man was found. According to Protocol Number 48, microscopic fibers of foreign origin were found on the surface of the expensive woolen fabric. These were fragments of coarse knitted wool in light gray and beige shades, which did not belong to any item of clothing found in the secret basement room. The experts came to an unequivocal conclusion. During the last weeks before his rescue, James Turner had prolonged and regular physical contact with a person who wore handmade knitted items. During his daily conversations with a psychologist, the results of which were reported to the investigation at 6 p.m. each evening, James himself claimed that his captors, the teacher and the lady, visited him every day. He described rituals that were never broken: morning greetings, breakfast, and evening lessons in calligraphy or reading aloud. However, when the technical analysis team finished reviewing the footage from 3 surveillance cameras installed on private property half a mile from the entrance to Blackwood Hall, the results were staggering. Over the past 4 months, no cars had approached the estate, and motion sensors on the only paved road leading to the forest had not detected any strangers. This discrepancy forced the detectives to change their tactics. Since the cameras did not record any movement from the city or major highways, the only logical explanation was that the kidnappers had entered the estate by routes that were not visible to the public. Blackwood Hall bordered 3 private estates located about a quarter of a mile away through a dense forest. The investigation team assumed that James's attackers were local residents who could walk to the basement every day, knowing every path in this cluttered area. On September 18th at 9 o'clock in the morning, detectives began going door to door in the neighboring areas. The first on their list was the home of an elderly couple, Charlie and Agnes Diaz. Their colonial-style house looked immaculate: a trimmed lawn, potted flowers on the porch, and a complete absence of any clutter. 70-year-old Charlie, a former history teacher, greeted the police with a polite smile. According to the detective's report, the couple seemed like the picture of friendliness. They treated the officers to tea and were genuinely surprised by the news that a person had been held captive in a neighboring abandoned mansion for 6 years. Agnes Diaz, dressed in a light wool sweater, said that she and her husband rarely left their property due to health problems and did not even look in the direction of Blackwood Hall, considering it a gloomy ruin. Next was the Miller family, who were raising 2 children aged 10 and 12. Their house was filled with noise and children's toys in the yard. The father of the family, Kevin, worked as an engineer for a construction company and was often away on business. During questioning, he stated that he had never noticed anything suspicious in the woods. His wife, Sarah, added that the children were strictly forbidden to play near Blackwood Hall because the building was in a state of disrepair. According to the detectives, the family seemed open, although Sarah Miller was noticeably nervous, constantly fixing her hair, which the police attributed to natural stress from the visit by law enforcement. The third location visited by investigators at 2:45 p.m. was a small modern cottage belonging to a young couple, Mark and Olivia Green. They had moved here only 3 years ago, which automatically excluded them from the list of suspects in James's abduction in 2013. However, the police did not rule out the possibility that they might have seen someone else. Mark, an avid cyclist, said that he often rode along forest trails, but the area around Blackwood Hall was so overgrown with bushes that it was difficult to get through even on foot. Despite the general atmosphere of friendliness, the detectives conducting the interviews were left with a lingering sense of unease about what was happening. One of the experienced officers later remarked in a private conversation with colleagues that there was a theatrical ordinariness in this quiet neighborhood. Each of the interviewees had a ready answer. Each showed the appropriate level of sympathy. But no one could remember a single detail from 6 years ago. It looked like a collective wall of silence erected around the forest. The investigators' attention was drawn to a detail they noticed during their visit to the Diaz home. In the backyard of their property, there was a small gazebo from which a barely noticeable but well-trodden path led toward the forest. Charlie Diaz explained that he sometimes went out to gather firewood for the fireplace. However, the direction of the path pointed directly to the north side of Blackwood Hall, the same side where the entrance to the cellar was located. As of the evening of September 18, 2019, the police were faced with an invisible enemy. Someone in knitted clothes crossed the threshold of the secret room every day, taught James Turner the manners of the last century, and disappeared into the shadows of the forest, remaining unnoticed by cameras and neighbors. The investigation began to realize that the key to solving the case lay not in the archives of the missing, but in the small details of the lives of those who lived just a few hundred feet from the crime scene. The wall of silence began to crack when detectives decided to carefully review James's testimony once again, searching his archaic language for clues that could point to a specific house or person among these friendly neighbors. On September 20, 2019, the investigation into James Turner's case moved from the phase of gathering circumstantial evidence to an active search for direct evidence. While analyzing audio recordings of the young man's sessions with a psychologist, one of the leading detectives of the department noticed a striking detail that had previously escaped his attention. James's manner of communication, emphatically polite, devoid of any modern slang, and saturated with complex grammatical constructions, was almost identical to Charlie Diaz's style of speech. During the first interview, the former history professor demonstrated the same bookish sophistication, using phrases that were considered anachronistic in the 21st century. According to the detective's words recorded in an internal memo, this did not seem to be a coincidence. It seemed that James Turner had not only listened to this man for 6 years, but had become his linguistic mirror image. This linguistic clue prompted law enforcement to reconstruct their visit to the Diaz couple's home in detail once again. Officer Ben Thompson, who accompanied the investigation team on September 18th, recalled a visual detail that had seemed insignificant to him at the time of the interview. As he stood in the Diaz living room, the door to one of the far rooms was ajar a few inches. In the narrow gap, he noticed the edge of a heavy, deep dark blue curtain. This observation matched exactly the description of James's first place of detention, the house with blue curtains, which he had mentioned during his panic attacks in the hospital. The geographical factor also testified against the elderly couple. The diocese property was closest to Blackwood Hall, and the border between their land and the estate's woodland was virtually unmarked by a fence. The distance from the back porch of their house to the secret entrance in the cellar was only 480 feet through the undergrowth. For someone familiar with the woods, this route would take no more than 5 minutes. However, despite all these coincidences, the police still did not have sufficient grounds to obtain a warrant for a full search or arrest. Conjectures about the color of curtains and peculiarities of pronunciation were not considered direct evidence of involvement in the kidnapping in American jurisprudence. The central object of the investigation was a note found in James's tuxedo pocket. The phrase, "Manners are the face of the soul," written in impeccable calligraphy, became the key to identifying the criminal. On September 21st at 10 a.m., investigators sent an official request to the archives of the University of Oregon, where Charlie Diaz had taught history for 25 years. The police gained access to his handwritten reports, lecture plans, and personal files. The investigation was conducted by a group of forensic experts specializing in handwriting identification. The comparative analysis took more than 12 hours. The experts focused on the capital letters and the specific slant of the pen. According to the final report of the forensic laboratory, the identity was confirmed by 18 key features. The characteristic writing of the letter M and the specific way of connecting vowels in the word face matched Charlie Diaz's handwriting samples from 20 years ago 100%. It was irrefutable physical evidence. This was the person who wrote the message that James Turner carried in the pocket of his prison uniform. The final link in the chain of evidence was to be the identification procedure. On September 21st at 4:30 p.m., in a room at the Riverbend Medical Center, Detective Thompson and Dr. Miller presented James with a series of photographs of local residents. It was a standard photo lineup where Charlie and Agnes Diaz's faces were hidden among 10 random photos. James's reaction was so violent that the doctors had to intervene. According to Dr. Miller, as soon as the young man's gaze fell on the photo of Charlie Diaz, his body instantly convulsed with uncontrollable fear. He did not cry out or cry. His muscles tensed to such an extent that he literally pressed himself into the back of the bed. His hand trembled as it slowly rose and pointed to the photo of the elderly couple. According to the testimony of the officers who were in the room, James whispered only 2 words: "It's them." His gaze, which had previously been detached, now showed the pure, paralyzing horror of a victim who had seen his executioner. With the handwriting analysis report and the results of the identification in hand, the investigation finally had the legal authority to take the next step. On September 21st at 7 p.m., Lane County Judge signed an order for the immediate arrest of the Diaz couple and a full search of their property. The Eugene police began preparing for the operation, understanding that behind the doors of the house with blue curtains could lie the answers to questions that the Turner family had been asking for 6 long years. Now the main task was to find the route by which the teacher and madam had transported their captive to the Blackwood Hall estate without leaving any traces in full view of the entire community. On September 22, 2019, at 6 o'clock in the morning, Eugene's Special Police Unit began storming the Diaz couple's residence. The operation, which had been prepared in complete secrecy, lasted only a few minutes. Charlie and Agnes Diaz were arrested in their own bedroom. According to the officers who carried out the arrest, the elderly couple appeared remarkably calm, as if they had prepared for this visit in advance. While the suspects were being taken to the police station, a group of 12 detectives began a thorough search of the house, which for 2 decades had been considered a model of respectable neighborhood. The most significant findings awaited investigators in Charlie Diaz's study. The room was filled with shelves of historical literature, but behind a false panel on one of the shelves, detectives discovered a metal filing cabinet containing detailed dossiers on 34 University of Oregon students. Each folder was labeled in calligraphic handwriting and contained photographs, travel itineraries, and notes about the young people's personal lives. James Turner's folder was the most voluminous. In his notes, Charlie described the young man as a diamond covered in the dirt of modernity. According to the detectives who studied these documents, James was chosen because of his, as the professor noted, defiant appearance and habit of disregarding rules. In the maniac's mind, this was interpreted as a calling. He believed he was saving the student's soul by snatching him away from the debauched 21st century. A search of Agnes Diaz's dressing room provided direct evidence of her complicity. On the top shelf of the wardrobe, forensic experts found 8 skeins of natural wool in light gray and beige colors. Laboratory express analysis confirmed that the structure and chemical composition of the fibers were completely identical to the fragments found on James's tailcoat in Blackwood. According to the investigation report, it was Agnes who personally sewed costumes from a bygone era for the captive, meticulously recreating the cut according to patterns from the 1880s. The role of Lady was to create a complete visual illusion of another time, where every detail of clothing had to conform to the strict canons of Victorian morality. However, the technical secret of how the kidnappers managed to remain undetected for 6 years was only revealed during an inspection of the basement of the Diaz's house. Behind a massive freezer for food, a camouflaged entrance to a narrow tunnel was found. According to the lead forensic engineer, this underground passage was approximately 500 feet long and reinforced with new wooden supports. Charlie Diaz, as a professional historian, knew about the existence of abandoned drainage systems and technical passages between Eugene's old estates. He personally restored this passageway, which connected his basement to the cellar of Blackwood Hall. This explained why the traffic cameras did not record any movement. The criminals literally moved underground, appearing in James's room like ghosts. The reconstruction of James's life during those 6 years, based on Charlie Diaz's diaries and the victim's initial testimony, revealed a system of horrific psychological and physical pressure. For the first 2 years, the young man was kept directly in the basement under the Diaz house, in the very room with blue curtains that he remembered. This was the breaking stage. James was punished for every word that did not correspond to the vocabulary of the 19th century. The use of modern terms or references to his past life were punished with blows from a thin woolen whip or deprivation of food for 48 hours. When his consciousness had been sufficiently altered by drugs and constant fear, he was transferred to Blackwood Hall, where the second stage began. Polishing. According to the teacher's notes, James had to spend 6 hours a day studying classical Latin, 4 hours practicing calligraphy, and 2 hours listening to lectures on etiquette. There were no mirrors in the room so that he would not see how his own face was changing from exhaustion. Charlie Diaz, in his notes, called this the pedagogy of violence, arguing that only through pain can a true aristocrat of the spirit be raised. Any attempt at resistance was suppressed by the administration of sedatives, which turned the student into an obedient puppet in a silk neckerchief. While examining the desk in the diocese basement room, investigators found a stack of notebooks filled with James's handwriting. They contained endless rewritings of the same phrase about manners and the soul. Each page was checked by Charlie Diaz, who corrected the slightest deviation in the slant of the letters with red ink. It was evidence of total control, where even the movement of the pen had to obey the will of the teacher. By the evening of September 22nd, the police had documented every element of this underground prison, realizing that behind the screen of academic politeness and neighborly friendliness lay a couple who, for 2,190 days, had methodically destroyed human personalities, replacing them with living props for their sick historical fantasy. All that remained was the trial that would put an end to this case that had shocked the entire state of Oregon. The trial in the case of State of Oregon versus Charlie and Agnes Diaz, which began in the Eugene District Court in early 2020, became one of the most high-profile and complex criminal cases in the region's recent history. Every day, the courtroom was packed with representatives of the press, lawyers, and ordinary residents trying to comprehend the magnitude of the crime that had taken place just a few hundred feet from their homes. The case file consisted of more than 15 volumes, including the results of technical examinations of the secret tunnel, toxicology reports on the drugs found in James Turner's blood, and Charlie Diaz's diaries, which became the main evidence of the couple's maniacal plan. Over the course of 21 days of court hearings, the prosecution methodically pieced together a picture of a 6-year nightmare. The main element of the prosecution's case was the testimony of forensic experts regarding the physical impact on the victim. According to medical examination reports, the body of the 25-year-old man had more than 40 scars from restraints and systematic beatings, which the criminals inflicted for the slightest violation of their 19th-century etiquette. During his speech, the prosecutor emphasized that this was not a typical kidnapping. It was an attempt to completely deconstruct human consciousness. The photos of the underground living room in Blackwood Hall, shown to the jury, looked like the set of a horror movie, where the immaculate cleanliness and antique furniture only emphasized the horror of James's complete isolation. Charlie Diaz's behavior in the courtroom came as a real shock to those present. The 70-year-old former history professor stood up straight, maintaining the same cold, aristocratic manner he had imposed on his captive for years. According to a court reporter, Diaz showed no sign of remorse or sympathy for the Turner family. In his final address to the jury, he stated that James was his most outstanding project. He claimed that 6 years in the basement were a necessary price to pay for cleansing the soul of the filth of modernity. According to Charlie, he did not torture the young man, but carved a masterpiece out of him, transforming an ordinary student guitarist into a model of refinement and nobility. These words, spoken without a tremor in his voice, finally convinced the jury of the fanatical danger of the accused. In contrast to her husband, Agnes Diaz tried throughout the trial to play the role of a merciful woman who only obeyed the will of her dominant partner. According to eyewitness accounts, she often cried, assuring those present that she loved James like her own son. However, the evidence gathered during a search of their kitchen and basement proved otherwise. It was Agnes who developed a diet consisting exclusively of dishes from the century before last, and it was she who mixed sedatives with the water James drank to keep him in a state of constant submission. The investigation proved that without her methodical support, this educational experiment could not have lasted so long. On March 14, 2020, the judge announced the final verdict. Charlie and Agnes Diaz were found guilty on all counts: first-degree kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment with aggravating circumstances, and systematic bodily harm. Both were sentenced to life imprisonment without the right to parole. Silence fell over the courtroom as the couple was led away in handcuffs. Charlie continued to look down on those present with an expression of contempt, while Agnes just shook her head helplessly, not looking at James's parents. However, for James Turner himself, the court's verdict was not an act of instant liberation. After 8 months of intensive rehabilitation at the Riverbend Medical Center, doctors came to a disappointing conclusion. His personality had undergone too profound a change. The modern world, with its noise of cars, flashing neon lights, and fast pace of life, caused James to have attacks of paralyzing horror. Every modern sound exceeding 30 decibels was perceived by his brain as a threat, forcing him to sit for hours in the corner of the room, with his hands covering his face. James now lives in a specialized closed facility located in a quiet part of the state, far from large cities. There are no electrical outlets in his room, and the only lighting comes from soft lamps that mimic gaslight. According to the staff at the rehabilitation center, he still communicates exclusively in a language filled with complex archaisms and is terrified of taking off his black tailcoat. This garment, sewn by Agnes Diaz, has become the only barrier separating him from the chaos of modern life. He has become a prisoner of his own appearance, unable to accept himself without the aristocratic armor that was the price of his 6 years of suffering. James's parents, Eleanor and Robert Turner, visit their son once a week, traveling 120 miles. During these visits, James is emphatically polite, but he rarely calls them his parents. To him, they are distinguished strangers from another dirty world. According to Robert Turner, the hardest thing is realizing that their son has returned physically, but his true essence remains buried in the basement of Blackwood Hall. The energetic young man who once dreamed of the big stage and playing guitar is gone forever, replaced by a silent shadow in a tailcoat who fears his own era and constantly seeks permission for the simple right to be himself. The story of James Turner remained in Eugene's archives as a reminder that sometimes the walls erected within the human mind prove to be much stronger than the concrete floors of abandoned estates.